Welcome everybody to the panel on the power of naming. I am so excited to be here today with all of our wonderful panelists to talk about the power of language and naming and how to use language to dismantle racism. I am going to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. And if I can share my screen. My name is Allison Bantimba. I am a campaign manager with the Center for Civil and Human Rights. I am very excited to be here with my colleague from Equitable Dinners, Adria Kitchen, who I will introduce shortly and who will be moderating this panel discussion. Before we get started, a few upcoming programs from the Center and Equitable Dinners. We have the economic impact of COVID in the Latinx community on October 9th. On October 12th, we have the Spirit. It's called Spirit. It's the focus on Indigenous art, artists and issues. And then on October 18th, we have our next Equitable Dinners conversation on racial equity and democracy, which is going to be a wonderful conversation. And Adria will share a little bit more about that at the end of our panel discussion this evening. And then also through the month of October, we have free admission to the center. Tickets must be reserved online in advance because we are still maintaining social distancing and safety precautions through the pandemic, but we are open. Thank you to Porsche for sponsoring this. So reserve your tickets and come see the exhibits in the center. We would love to have you there. And then one final disclaimer, all the comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent the official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And with that, and with that, I will introduce Adria Kitchens. She is the program manager for Equitable Dinners and just a wonderful person. So thank you, Adria, welcome.
Thank you so much, Allison. I so appreciate that. Well, I am really excited to be here with everyone today and with an amazing group of panelists. And I will just give some short introductions because I do believe their bios will be up on the screen so you can hear a little bit more about them. So Ms. Kira Simon, she wants to be known as a word nerd and educator. She is from the Anti-Defamation League. She's the director of curriculum and training at the Anti-Defamation League. And next, Dr. Jonathan Gayles, Black Girl Dad, is how he wants to be known today. And I love that because I'm a big, huge daddy's girl. And Dr. Gayles is professor and chair of African American Studies at Georgia State University. And we are joined by also Hilary Beard, an independently employed health writer and journalist who has co-authored 15 books about Black life and has co-authored a book that we really want to lift up today, Raising Black Boys to Succeed in School and in Life. And we are so excited. I'm sorry, Promise is Kept, Raising Black Boys to Succeed in School. And we are so excited to have her with us today. And we're going to jump into our conversation in just a moment. I just want to give a little context. So the context for today's conversation, we called it the power of naming. And what we really want to do is look at how propaganda and how coded language impacts and how that shows up inside of systemic racism, how it impacts us now, how we see it today. We will be looking at the Atlanta Massacre of 1906 as a framing for the various ways in which coded language and propaganda shows up. So the Atlanta Massacre of 1906 is most commonly referred to as the 1906 race riots of Atlanta. And just in hearing those two terms, we can see that it does not accurately describe the mob of thousands of white men who terrorized the Black community in Atlanta and murdered at least 25 Black men and women. Those are the ones that are known. Many more are known to have died during that time and during that massacre. And so there were several instances of how media incited this violence by using coded language that Negro men were assaulting white women. And we see that quite frequently, not just in past news media and past reports, but also in our media today, where coded language is used to incite people to violence and plays such a huge role in systemic racism. So I'm going to invite our panelists to say hello, and also if you can share with us how you see propaganda naming the use of coded language to be critical to the framing of our stories and their impact on the narratives that exist in our society and culture today. And I'm just going to start on my screen the way you all are ordered, if that's okay. I'm going to start with Hilary Beard.
Hello, Adria. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to have the opportunity to be involved in this conversation with you. So I am a journalist and a member of the media. And so I just want to share a statistic that some of you might find interesting. So the Heinz Foundation in Pittsburgh did a study in the 20-teens of media coverage of Black males in Pittsburgh. And so one of the things that they found was that Black males comprised 6% of the population of that city. However, 86% of the coverage of Black male, 86% of news coverage in Pittsburgh was of not only of Black males, it was about Black males committing a crime. And so only 14% of stories in the media at all were about anything having to do with something positive about a Black man's life, a Black male's life, about him being a family member or a parent or a student or involved in government or leadership or in their community, the environment, right? And so throughout the media, we see this disproportionate coverage of the so-called criminality of Black and brown people. And so it's disproportionately covered for us, which means it's disproportionately not covered. The criminality of white people is disproportionately not covered. And so this is structural, it's intentional. People know that the way to get a person's attention is to scare them. And so the media, among other institutions, but we're talking about the media in this particular case. And so the media intentionally use this to scare you and attract your attention. They know that a frightened mind, they can command the attention of it. It's what your brain does automatically above and beyond your free will. And so they manipulate us by manipulating images of Black and brown people, particularly around crime. And so even today with the evening news, you'll often find that the evening news leads with a story about crime. And so because the coverage is inaccurate and disproportionate, and crime and violence begin to be equated with Black and brownness, even though that's not necessarily the case. I shared with you guys that I have been spending some of my summer working on a children's book, an adaptation of an adult book called The Burning, which is actually about the Tulsa race massacre of 1921, which was also called a race riot for years. And so same story, media incited the violence. And so this is structural, this is intentional, and this is how they sell newspapers and magazines and get you to watch television shows. And we see it very actively in the media today. We see our elected officials all the way up to the highest office of the land using not even such coded language anymore. I mean, they're very open about it. We're beyond dog whistles. We're saying, Proud Boys stand back and stand down, right? And so this is very old. And so that's just one example.
Wow. Thank you, Hilary. And at the cost of Black and brown lives, right?
Yes.
Brown lives. So, so poignant what you're sharing, and I think so key to kind of the start of this conversation, right? If we look at what happened in 1906 and what you were sharing, the Tulsa massacre, and then still seeing that today and what that really means for us today. Yes. As we are, you know, in the space and time that we're in now, what that means and what that can mean.
Yes.
For in terms of, I know for myself, being a mother of 3 beautiful brown children, definitely a Black boy, that I feel, and sometimes in fear of violence being enacted upon them. So thank you so much. I'm gonna let's get some comments from Dr. Gayles. Jonathan, you want to share with us?
Yeah, but thank you, and I'm honored to be part of this this program, and I absolutely want to second everything that Hilary said. And I think the other function of language in this particular space, and it's becoming more and more clear in this moment, is to introduce ambiguity where there should be no ambiguity. And so to transition from race riots to a massacre is an important step. But I think we should also, and I struggle with this at Georgia State, as we are trying as an institution to respond to this summer, which of course is an extension of a long history of violence against Black bodies. And there's this hesitance to talk about white supremacy. And there's this hesitance to introduce the reality of whiteness in our language. And that introduces ambiguity, which reduces our ability to respond in meaningful and constructive ways. And so, when we think about Atlanta in 1906, what would it mean for us historically to describe this as a white race riot? All right, so you eliminate the ambiguity, and what that does is it brings you closer to the truth of the matter. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but language functions to support the idea that whiteness is normative. So white people in this nation don't have race, everyone else has race. And so that invites the kinds of race causal explanations around phenomena that Hilary was just describing. Race is only relevant when it involves someone that is not white, and perhaps most especially when it's someone that is Black and brown. And so that's something I try to remind my students to consider, the way in which language introduces that kind of ambiguity, and the way in which then ambiguity makes it more difficult for us to understand the truth.
I love that. And I know we'll get into that a little bit more about these things that remain unnamed, right? That introduces the ambiguity that you're speaking to. I think it's so critical. It's been critical, but definitely critical today for us to really be able to name these things and put them out there in the open. Kira, I would love to hear from you, and then we'll move forward with our next question.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. My role right now at the Anti-Defamation League is as a curriculum and education specialist, focusing on helping our audiences understand biases and the role identity plays in our lives, communicating across differences and interpreting differences, navigating oppression and understanding our relationship to it, and taking action. And so that's the lens that I'm going to apply as I walk through this conversation. And I really want to echo a lot of what my co-panelists here said, Hilary and Jonathan. And one of the things that connects to our understanding of bias, especially Hilary, you mentioned this, that the way that the media frames how current events are reported and how the public understands it and engages in that dialogue really contributes to the biases that we develop, and that helps to replicate systems of oppression and maintain power dynamics that exist in our society. So as I'm thinking about how young people grow up and learn both their own understanding of who they are, but how they operate in relation to our world, and a lot of that is through stories. They hear stories about the past and stories about what is going on around them, and they consider how it applies to them. And when we lack the language to describe our identity and our relationship to the systems that exist, or we lack the language to describe those systems at all and who benefits and who is harmed, it really does create that ambiguity, right, that Jonathan was talking about, that makes it confusing and easy to be manipulated into believing the narratives that are told to us without question. So I think about some of the core concepts of anti-bias learning, that understanding that everyone has an identity and that contributes to their lens, and examining power dynamics, right? Looking at who is helped and who is harmed by the way a story is told, can help to unravel some of that ambiguity and actually figure out what is the negative impact, especially to marginalized people, and in this case of the Atlanta Massacre of 1906, the harm that was done to Black people, both then and the legacy that still exists today. I think often of the quote by Toni Morrison, definitions belong to the definers. And so who gets to tell the story, right? Who gets to center themselves and choose the words that describe both historical and current events really shapes what kind of legacy they can have and what impact they'll have on the future. I'm excited to continue exploring this.
This is a rich conversation because I love what you were sharing, and all of you really, because what Hilary touched on was the intentionality behind it, right? This intentional naming of Black and brown people, aligning us with violence. And also this idea of let's leave it very ambiguous who white people are in this, so they never actually get named. So then it just becomes a norm. And I think it's critical for us to look at the places where it's unnamed, like the places where we're missing it, so that we can begin to name it for people, right? We can begin to see it and make people aware of how that shows up and what role that plays in systemic racism today. And so I just want to open it up for whoever wants to share first. Like when you think about the places where propaganda and coded language and these things go unnamed, the places that we're missing, because I think in many ways, like Hilary was saying, it's not very coded anymore, right? We see it very, very much out there. And I still think there's some places actually that we overlook it, even I overlook it, right? Because I'm in the same soup that everybody else is in. And I want to be able to name those things too. So who wants to share on that first? To jump in.
Can I hop back in and kind of build on
Yes.
what Kira was talking about? So I love that she brought up this idea of stories, right? Because we're talking about the Atlanta Race Massacre, which was not well known for 100 years? Is that correct? After it happened?
Yes.
And so there's stories we tell and there's stories we don't tell, right? And so one of the things that I've learned as I've been doing research about the Tulsa Race Massacre is that one of the stories that we don't tell about the United States is that between about 1890 and 1930 or 40 was a period that historians call the nadir, the low point, or a bottom of race relations in the United States. And so a narrative that we have is that we have experienced constantly improving race relations, and that is not the fact. And so the story that we don't tell is that race relations have ebbed and flowed. And so during this particular period, there were many, many, many race massacres. In fact, this was very much a norm. So I could name you city after city: New York, New York again, New York again. I live in Philadelphia, Philadelphia, Philadelphia again, Philadelphia again. We have Springfield, Illinois. We have Atlanta. We have New Orleans. We have Brownsville, Texas. So we can go on. And these are the ones that we know about, which means they were large enough, violent enough, destructive enough that they got reported in the media, right? However, these things happened all the time. And so a story that we often don't tell, and so part of the reason they happened was around white supremacy, to reestablish white supremacy, to keep African Americans as close as slavery as possible. This was the stated objective: to keep us in fear, to keep us terrorized, to keep us from being politically empowered, to keep the races separate, to penalize us. It's really amazing how many stories of Black success there were coming out of slavery. So people who were enslaved and the children of people who were enslaved established these dynamic and successful communities where they were entrepreneurs. And so in Atlanta, as in Tulsa and other places, Rosewood, other places, these are vibrant communities where people have independent businesses and they're doing very well. In fact, so well, many of them, that they're doing much better than many of the whites in the area. And so we don't have stories of poor whites. We don't have stories of illiterate whites. We don't have stories of how Black empowerment and self-help and advancement during that period and beyond threatens people, right? And people who have been taught that they are supreme and that they are better than, and this totally upends that narrative. And so in this country, white people have used violence repeatedly. It's a norm in this country. It's the story of this country with Black and brown people to keep Black and brown people in their place. And so one of the things that I learned when doing the research about this book was after emancipation, Black people went everywhere in the United States, every corner, every, Minnesota, Montana, we went every place. And part of the reason we ended up in communities together is because we were driven out of these communities by white mob violence. And so it was intentional, it was purposeful, it was often, the media often incited it, and there was often up underneath it a lie on the part of a white woman who would claim that a Black male assaulted her, typically sexually assaulted her. And so white mob violence was common, lynchings, which are public killings of people, particularly during this period. So lynching was common throughout the United States. It was a form of like vigilante frontier justice. But during this period in particular and beyond, it became increasingly and in some places almost exclusively trained upon Black people to keep us terrorized, to push us out of competition with white folks. There were riots in Memphis, mob violence in Memphis, lynchings in Memphis. As a matter of fact, that's how a lot of folks ended up in Tulsa, is they were running from violence in Memphis. And so Black people have literally been herded into communities together. And we chose to be together for safety, because this is so common. And even today, many of us experience this in terms of exclusion, right? Being left out of things, not getting the memo, or the threat of, if you are who you are, you say what you need to say, you might lose your job, you might not have access to things, your child might be penalized, right? And so this type of behavior continues to this day, and Black and brown people live in fear of it.
You said so many rich things. I'm gonna see if Jonathan or Kira want to jump in, because that was just chock full.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. So let's work backwards so we can consider President Trump's recent executive order about what it is that we should and shouldn't be teaching. I think it's a very powerful moment for us to consider the stakes of this conversation, the implications of this conversation most broadly considered. And for me, thinking about everything that Hilary just shared, if we think about the term terrorism, I think for many, people think that the first act of terrorism in the United States was Tulsa, Oklahoma. And for most people, I would even argue 9/11. But what would it mean for us in terms of our sense of ourselves as a nation to understand all of these kinds of moments and violence, all these kinds of violence, as acts of white terror against Black people, Black citizens of the United States? Well, we understand the answer because that would disrupt this narrative, but it would also certainly bring us so much closer to the truth. So again, when we talk about language and coded language, the purpose is to hide and obfuscate the truth. I tell my students that I'm a first generation free Black man, and they look at me and say, well, what in the world are you talking about? But it's true. I'm the first child in my family born into this nation where it was not legal to enslave or disenfranchise Black people. I'm the first, but because of the way in we use the way in which we use language or fail to use language, we don't have a proper sense of history. So therefore, most of us are unable to make connections to what we're seeing now in media to these historical moments. So this is not new. This is just a repeat of things that have happened historically. And so to the extent that we don't understand it in these broader historical terms, the way in which our language, the language we choose to use, doesn't empower us to see these connections, we are doomed to repeat these things again and again and again. And it drives me absolutely mad.
No, I love what you're sharing. And Kira, you're welcome to jump in. And what Hilary was sharing about all the unnamed stories of white people, of white violence, right, against Black people, all of those unnamed stories, which now, when we talk about our current climate and the climate of it's okay to speak, that I'm going to declare, declare war on our own government, or declare war on Black and brown bodies, in response to a protest. To me, it's just, oh my God, I'm like Jonathan, it drives me mad that this is what is happening. So Kira, please jump in.
And I think what you just said about it being very cyclical, right? It's the same story over and over and over again. And a couple terms are really standing out to me. Like thinking about the phrase race riot that is so commonly used right now in the description of demonstrations and protests across the country, but is also used to describe historical events. It frames violence as a disturbance of the peace, right? Which truly actually is a disturbance of the status quo, and not framing it as a rebellion, right? Or an uprising or a revolution, or in some cases, a massacre, an act of terrorism, as Jonathan was saying. And that's one example where we see just the same coded language. But I also think about the way, and we see this, I think, in the executive order, and we also even saw it in the topics of the debate that happened last week, that we frame race as a problem to be addressed and discussed instead of looking at racism. And we use every possible phrase in our education and the media to try to avoid saying that we need to talk about racism. Race relations is one that's often used, right? Or like the problem with race. I think if you look back in history, you see documents labeled the Negro problem. And this is something that needed to be solved. And what it ends up doing, I think when I look at the way we teach US history as separate from Black history in schools in K-12, it frames racism as something that just happens to Black people and other people of color, and not something that was created and intentionally put upon Black people and other people of color in order to bring about a certain society and a certain system that benefited white people. And that it goes back to that erasure of whiteness that is still a very challenging barrier to get through, made even more challenging now by this executive order that says it's not acceptable in these particular types of trainings to talk about white privilege. I'll tell a little secret, it's not going to change the trainings that I'm delivering to schools every single day. So, but that it is just another way to put up some kind of invisible wall to conceal that there is intentionality behind the way that people are grouped by race. And there is intentionality behind the systems that maintain racism and the way that it's maintained just in our culture and traditions.
Thank you, Kira. And I think just all of you are bringing up these amazing nuances, because what I see is that we have this current climate of divisiveness that is just getting even wider, right? In the use of our language, the use of propaganda, the not naming all of these things that need to be named, not naming whiteness, not naming, and also putting names on Black and Brown people of violence. So I would love to hear from you on where you see this current split, and the divisiveness in our country, what that means for us in terms of language and the propaganda that's being used. And any of you can jump in, because I think it's definitely it's causing us to get we're I don't know if we were ever together, but we're definitely further and further apart. And it's almost like, where do we find the spaces where we can come together? But first, if we can talk about the divisiveness, the climate of divisiveness, and how propaganda is really widening that.
I'll jump in and try to be brief. I think, was it that Kamala Harris said, dog whistle through a bullhorn? I feel more unsafe now than I've ever felt. Well, I've had police pull their guns on me on 3 separate occasions, so I felt pretty unsafe then. But in terms of where we are as a nation, I feel more unsafe now than ever before. And part of it certainly is because of the ability of the president to amplify through this language these long-standing, simmering feelings of fragility that I think in very much is a response to 8 years of an Obama presidency with his beautiful Black wife and his beautiful Black daughters and a Black dog. So it was just too much Blackness. And I think we are in dangerous times, because what's happening is, and Kira makes this point extremely well, the way in which we understand race as a problem, instead of talking about white supremacist racism, white supremacy. I'm thinking of Moya Bailey's work, and when she talks about, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, just to really point things out. Because we're not doing it, it feels as if things are just happening, which decreases our ability to feel empowered to respond. Language is part of that. When we were talking earlier, I was thinking about the way in which, Stuart Hall talks about floating signifiers, and the Black body has written upon it a certain kind of language, so that in certain spaces, you need not say anything if you're Black. You are read as if you are read as a text, and that meaning has nothing to do with your identity, who you are as a father or a mother or a sister or whatever the case may be. So in these days, in this current political climate, because of our use of language, or again, the lack thereof, it feels as if we are not connected to all of these things that are happening, and speaking as a Black person, happening to us. But if we were to use the right kind of language, it wouldn't transform things, but it would certainly enhance our ability to understand exactly what and how, what is happening, how it is happening, and why it is happening.
Thank you. Hilary, Kira, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would love to. I think I'm thinking back to the mention of ambiguity versus clarity, right? And Jonathan, you just said that language can't solve everything, but if you can't name something, if you don't have the precise language to talk about it, nothing can be addressed. So something that comes to mind for me that we're hearing a lot right now is law and order. That is a commonly used by our president, but it's also being used by many other leaders as well. I believe Joe Biden mentioned it as well in response at the debate. And we hear that term a lot, and we don't define that often. I mean, some might hear that and think, well, that's a television show. But what we have to spend a lot more time examining, what is the purpose behind using that phrase? Who are we trying to signal to? Who is getting the order, the safety, the protection, and from whom? And I think it goes back to my earlier point about thinking through who benefits and who is harmed and the power dynamics of the language that we use. by only using these catchphrases that are really flashy and go well in a tweet or can be shouted out to interrupt someone or respond to a post. We send a lot of emotion and we send a lot of signals, but we don't really clearly define what the problem is that we're trying to address and what we think needs to be done. So one of the tools that we have to unravel is questioning, right? And pushing back and probing what something means. And that can't always be done when we hear this from the President of the United States, right? We don't all have access to probe those statements, but we do with each other, right? And we can use those in our classrooms or in our conversations with other people.
I love that you shared that, Kira, because I like Jonathan, as much as we've been hearing about law and order from our executive branch, I actually feel more unsafe than I've ever felt in my entire life, for myself and for my family. And those unnamed, like who is the law and order for? Like who are we protecting and who are we protecting those people from? So Hilary, I think you were going to jump in as well.
Okay, I'm having so many thoughts, and so they're coming to me at once. And so, so Jonathan was talking about not having the language to talk about things, about, you know, patriarchy and kyriarchy and like all these different layers of the structure of power. And so a thought that came to my mind is the history of that and the history of the 1% and the 0.5%, right, who pitted working class white and Black people against each other, people who should have interests in common, the intentionality around pitting people against each other so that they don't come together and rise up in, Kira said, rebellion or revolution together to push back and on the way society is structured and restructure and cause resources and privileges to be reallocated in a more equitable way. So that is a thought that comes to my mind. It's very clear that many white people have been taught, and not only white people, but many white people have been taught to see the enemy as Black and brown people, as opposed to, for instance, 1%ers, right, who are pulling the puppet strings and sucking the resources from every other strata of society to themselves so that they have so much money and so many resources that they could not possibly spend it in anybody's lifetime. That kind of intergenerational wealth. I'm also thinking about what Kira said around signaling. And so a quote came to my mind when she said that. And in the Tulsa race massacre research that I've been doing, I learned that one of the things that the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan used to say, and so this was an era that we're talking about in which Klan membership was rising again very rapidly, that one way to increase membership was to have a good riot. And so when I think about Donald Trump's languaging around people taking to the streets and or the GOP's attempts to make peaceful protesting a crime, or standing in the street a crime, like all these criminalizing of peaceful protest and rights that are protected in the Constitution. And so that came to my mind. You know, Kira mentioned law and order. Well, historically, we're talking about the Atlanta race massacre. And so language around standing back and standing down, right? So law and order was involved in these race massacres, right? The sheriff was involved, the police were involved, the criminal justice system was involved, and they would literally stand back and stand down. And so many times when Black people, typically Black men, were lynched or white mob violence was directed at Black communities, the police, the sheriff, they might actually let the white mob come into the jail and take the person out to mete out mob violence, as opposed to allowing the criminal justice system to work. And so the police and the sheriff and the law enforcement, the law and order would allow this to happen. And so they were used to protect white people, white assets, white property, white resources, but very rarely would they stand up for Black and brown people who were being killed, tortured, and in the case of lynchings, public spectacle lynching often hundreds and sometimes thousands of people in the community, white people in a community coming to watch. I mean, this was entertainment. The torture and mutilation very oftentimes of Black men, might take all day, shooting, cutting, mutilating, taking body parts home for souvenirs, taking pictures. Like, this was part of the culture. So that came to my mind. In terms of current language, conversations about Democrat cities, right? That's coded language for Black and brown people. Conversations about not being able to trust mail-in balloting. That's conversations about Black and brown people's criminality. Conversations about monitoring polling places, right? That's about controlling us. So, and oh yeah, and the stand back and stand down, that's the call out to the lynch mob, right? That's come out and handle this extra legally. And so in this context, I think it's also really important to identify that, you know, even the Justice Department is publishing that the police, the military, law enforcement has long been infiltrated by white supremacists, right? And so in their functions that we pay for them to execute with our tax dollars, they are often intentionally executing a white supremacy and white supremacist violence upon us sanctioned by the state, in part because they're white supremacists, and they are standing back and standing down and letting people like Kyle Rittenhouse come into Kenosha, Wisconsin, shoot innocent, peaceful protesters, and then walk through the police and get a water bottle and a high five, because oftentimes they're part of the system. And so all of this kind of language is very much coded language that, I mean, it's not, it's so important that we know what it harkens back to, and that, as Kira said, signaling is happening. So if we don't know what those words are and the history of those words, as Jonathan was saying, you know, President Trump can sit in the Rose Garden and signal and speak to his people, and we have no idea what's happening. And it's important that we need to know, because, as you all say, our lives are very much in jeopardy right now, particularly over the next few months.
Can I jump in really quick?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, please do.
And extend this forward a bit. You know, in terms of signaling and the kinds of realities that Hilary is mentioning, again, you know, I think the other way in which language is used, and in reflecting the power structures that exist in white supremacy, to be more specific, is that it suffocates any expression of selfhood. Okay, it makes any expression of selfhood somehow wrong, somehow threatening, etc. So I've done some research and produced a film on the Ebonics debate. It was a local school system in Oakland, California. Less than 2 months later, there was a Senate hearing on a local school district simply acknowledging the fact that students from Oakland were bringing to class with them a different language style, a Senate hearing. So, you know, moving forward to the present day, why is it that, and the way in which white supremacy as it relates to language suffocates expressions of selfhood, the idea that the expression or the assertion that Black lives matter is then rendered as some sort of threat is a perfect example of this. An affirmation that one's own life matters must be countered and regarded somehow as wrong. And that reflects what white supremacy, because what is heard, what that signals for many people is not that my life matters. What it signals is my life matters as much as your life matters, which is absolutely untenable. And so the response, all lives matter, again, invokes the normative status of whiteness. So they need not say white lives matter more. simply by saying all lives matter because of the normative status of whiteness, it means what we understand that it means. And so we have to be very, very sophisticated in understanding that and insistent, and not allowing these kinds of formal and informal rules around language to have us rewrite what it is that we would say. No, Black lives matter. And so I'm always, reminded of the way in which these structures teach you to avoid any kind of authentic expression of your own selfhood. And that is another way in which language operates as well.
Wow, wow. Thank you. Thank you. Kira, jump in, and then we have a question in our Q&A box.
Thank you. I really appreciate Jonathan bringing back whiteness again, because one of the things that I am remembering and thinking in this conversation is the lack of stamina, and I'm generalizing here, that most white people have to be able to talk about their racial identity and their relationship to racism is such a hindrance. And a phrase that one of my colleagues uses often comes to mind when we talk about bias and intentionality versus unintentional biases that come out. Many people, especially people with with privileged identities like white people, always have a perfectly logical explanation for what it is they are doing. There is a perfectly logical explanation for saying race and violence, right? Or saying law and order. You can always come up with something to explain why the signal is used instead of clearly describing the white supremacist beliefs that are being espoused. And so part of the work that speaking to other white people that we need to do better at, and that as a nation everyone needs to do better at, is poking holes in those perfectly logical explanations. It is not enough to just accept that I am unaware of the history that is tied to a term, or I'm unaware of the implications that are tied to invoking a phrase like law and order. That's no longer acceptable. We live in an age where all of that information is perfectly accessible to us, and there's no excuse not to be able to understand that lens. But because of that lack of stamina, right, that lack of experience in talking about myself as with a racialized identity, it's so common and it's so easily replicated, and we learn it from a very, very young age as well, which is why I think I tend to focus, my work is focused very much on empowering teachers to be able to have these conversations, but also family members, right, and parents. We learn it over and over again from the first time that we understand who we are in the world and we know whether or not we have a racial identity.
Thank you, Kira, because I think that's a great segue into the question we have in the chat, which is around what strategies are there to break through the isolated exposure to information that many Fox News viewers have. And I would say that as we've looked at social media, we know the algorithms really keep us inside of these silos, which I think is what this question is really pointing to, as well as our choices and what we watch on the news. So I'm wondering if you can share strategies for us to begin to break through some of these silos that people are in. Specifically, this one is about Fox News viewers. But even beyond that, they're probably more extreme than just what we see on Fox, right? There's very much more extreme white supremacist groups. But what are some strategies that will really support us?
I'll just share very quickly that I think a question that we should ask ourselves and then model this out loud for others is, what am I being asked to accept with this information? What am I being asked to agree with or to see behind the language? And every individual can do this for themselves, but by doing so out loud and publicly, either by writing it down or in conversation, it invites others to do that as well.
I would agree. I would also say that this is not something that I endeavor to do any longer. Just because of working in African American studies, there are frequently students in my class, and it's clear from day one that they enroll in the class to, one, challenge me, And two, once they realize that that challenge will be met, two, then the second thing that they want me to do is to teach them instead of the entire class. And so being in the discipline in which I'm currently located, and also being Black, I simply don't have the energy anymore to try to talk people away. You know, I will rely on experts like Kira, for example, because most of my energy now is focused on trying to understand what is happening, trying to endure what is happening. And so, to be quite honest, and this may not sound very, very humane or kind, but unless it is something that will impact my ability to support and provide for my family and my loved ones, I'm in spaces where I hear ignorant things frequently, but I do a certain calculus where I decide, is it worth my energy? And then unless it's going to impact my day-to-day and my ability, again, to protect and care for the people that I love, I generally decide not to invest any time and energy. And that is a completely honest and transparent answer.
Well,
Hilary?
hello, Dr. Kamara Jones. Thank you for your question. So as Kira was talking about, I wrote down her language, the lack of stamina that many white people have to talk about race. Literally, I was receiving a phone call from somebody who I love and consider a very dear friend, who is a white woman, who I've taken a step back from around this exact issue. And so her lack of stamina shows up, one of the ways it shows up in her is in her inability to accept that I am taking control over my body and where I share my love and attention and energy, and focusing on myself. And so to build on what Dr. Gayles said, I too am not in a place where I have energy to spare. And so I've actually designed my life in many ways to protect myself from that. I come from a long line of people who lost many years of their life and quality of their life as a result of health problems caused by racial stress. And I view it as a revolutionary act on my part to protect myself from that as much as possible. Additionally to that, I'm 58 years old, and the older I get, the clearer I become about my limited time and energy, and that I am a limited resource. And so a thing that I am aware of and that I have been guilty of and was very guilty of when I was younger is that we actually have brain drain away from Black and brown communities as we internalize this white supremacist narrative that oftentimes the only way that we can provide for ourselves is to leave our families, our communities, to turn our attention away from the issues that affect us. And so early in my life, I did that, and I did it out of fear. And by my late 20s and early 30s, I was able to name my fear and to name my lack of courage. And so I think it's really important that we know the stories of the people who came before us, because I made a decision that it was no longer acceptable for me to have benefited from the courage of my ancestors who were terrorized, right? And we're using this, this language, riot is used instead of terrorism or massacre or genocide or ethnic cleansing or pogrom or any of those types of words, which are very accurate. And so it was no longer acceptable for me to be the descendant of people who had lived and actually thrived through those things and be able to pontificate my navel, with the privilege that I have as a Black woman, and be fearful. And so I decided to take steps away to make sure that I was pursuing my calling as opposed to a fear-based thing that I was doing to provide for myself. And my calling is to focus my resource on my community, and primarily on my community. And my belief is that There are so many untapped resources in our community that by focusing, like no other group focuses outside of themselves. And so I'm focusing on myself. I'm interested in myself, plural. I'm interested in developing the amazingness of marginalized people, particularly Black people, but I'm open and working with people with marginalized identities. I love my white co-conspirator allies who are able to use their expertise in their own communities. And so I'm actually not Dr. Kamara trying to have conversations with Fox viewers or even MSNBC viewers, right, who have work to do as well. We like to talk about Fox viewers, we like to talk about Southerners, but I live in Philadelphia surrounded by a lot of Northern MSNBC viewers who have a lot of work to do. And, you know, I'm grateful for those who are around me who are doing it.
Thank you. You know, I could talk to you all forever. We have 4 minutes. 4 minutes left here. So I know we have at least just one announcement to make closer to the end, but I was wondering if we could do just like a laser, how can people find you or your work and what you are doing in the world? Whoever wants to start.
I'm at Georgia State University. You can just do a Google search on my name. And we are actually working with the Auburn Avenue Research Library, offering a series of, we're piloting a Freedom School this semester. And in the spring, we'll be launching a more robust Freedom School with lecturers from Georgia State and lecturers from the community coming together to offer content for students at Georgia State and people from the community. So you can, I believe, sign up for our social media accounts by visiting our website at this aas.gsu.edu.
Thank you.
If you check out adl.org/education, you can see the anti-bias resources for parents, educators, family members, and even also some great resources if you are not necessarily attached to an educational institution. So please check out our work there. I'm also on Twitter at ADL_education if you want to keep an eye on other opportunities like webinars and things like that.
Thank you. Hilary?
Hi, you can find me on my website, hilarybeard.com. I'm a 1L Hilary, last name Beard as in grows on your chin. And I'll type into, okay, you typed into chat. I'm at Hilary Beard on Twitter. I'm Hilary Beard author on Facebook. And don't bother with my Instagram. My Instagram game's weak.
Well, I thank all of you all for being here today. Just as a quick announcement, earlier, Allison did share that I am the Equitable Dinners Program Manager, and we do bring people together to talk about race and racism. Dr. Kamara Jones, we have the honor of having her as one of our design team members. So we have a dinner coming up October 18th on race, equity, and democracy. And we will be with Dr. Suzanne Mettler and Deandra Rose talking about Dr. Suzanne Mettler's new book, The Four Threats in American Crises. Our democracy. So that should be a wonderful conversation. We would love for you to come out. We bring people together every month, every third Sunday, to talk about issues regarding race equity. And we focus on a new lens every month, whether it's housing or health, voting rights. We will be talking about activism coming up in November. And we are actually planning out the rest of our conversations over the next year. And we're also being very cognizant of what's happening in our nation. So we're being very careful and intentional about making sure that we're in alignment with what's happening. So it's been a pleasure to be with all of you. You all are amazing. To have been a part of this panel. Would love to talk to all of you more and have you be a part of that, and hope that you will participate in our Equitable Dinners. And you can find us at equitableddinners.com. And Allison has also put the link in the chat where you can sign up for our dinners. And I love this. And I also love working with Black women. That is my passion. So I have a big focus on supporting Black women and their own empowerment and our own voices and our own healing in the world. So thank you so much for being here this evening. And we hope to see you again soon in one of the National Center panels. All right, thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, bye everyone. It's great being with you today.
Bye.